Coming up on Time for Hope.
This pain is so great. As I can see why a person would do drugs, alcohol, sex, food, gambling, working, shopping.
Divorce?
Yeah, divorce, yes. And you do anything to try to get out of this pain.
Join Dr. Freda Crews, licensed professional counselor, and her guests as they provide practical solutions to real-life problems on Time for Hope.
We appreciate you joining us for another edition of Time for Hope. I'm Dr. Freda Crews, your host, and today I'm going to be presenting our third study in a series of studies titled Coping with Grief and Loss. And as I promised last week, we're going to pick right up with where I left off and go through the stages of grief. And I also said last week that they had been researched and set out for us by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She has 5 stages of grief, and it doesn't mean that we just go in the order that I'm going to set them out. But as a general rule, they do kind of follow this order, but sometimes they go back and forth through these 5 stages. Then others have come up with the first stage for acute grief, and we talked about the 2 kinds last week, the acute grief and anticipatory grief. And by the way, if you missed the first 2 studies, you can go to our website and catch right up with us. So when we think of acute grief, then we think of shock. If we're not expecting a death, if parents are notified that they have a teenager that's at the hospital or has just been killed in an automobile accident, or if we ourselves have an accident and we are told the sad news that we might not recover, like for instance with a stroke or whatever, and sometimes this is for those family members or loved ones that are involved, there can be shock. We just go into a state of, or a stage of shock when it's unexpected grief. So, but this in a way, it's a gift. It's a gift from God Himself, that it can act as a buffer so that we don't feel the full impact of what has just happened or the news that's just been delivered to us immediately. So with acute grief, there can be, the first stage can be shock. Then also right along with that can be Dr. Kubler-Ross's first stage that we are talking about, and that is denial. Even with the shock, we can say, oh no, there has to be some mistake. It must be somebody else's child, or I would like a second opinion on this, or and so there is that denial that this could actually have been happening or is going to happen. So the first stage can be denial. Now, if we stay in denial too long, it can go into what we call a complicated or abnormal grief. And some have even referred to an unattended grief. Now, I've mentioned small griefs or smaller deaths, but I've been majoring on the major grief related to the loss of a significant person or something else that's very significant that we are significantly attached to in our lives that brings grief. But there are what we call smaller deaths that maybe we've never grieved, so a death can go, or there can be a grief that is unattended, and denial can assist us, as it were, in not attending to griefs or losses, I should refer to, that have taken place in our lives that actually did produce grief, but we either suppressed or repressed or failed to attend to that grief. So denial, although it can serve a purpose early on, we don't want to stay in that stage of grief. And before I finish, you're going to see that I'm going to suggest that we actually come and face the reality of and the truth of the particular loss that is causing us grief. And then we move on to anger, and I've already mentioned that. I mentioned that in probably the second study in this series, that a person can be very angry and go through a stage of anger when they are grieving over the loss of a loved one, or, as I have already referred to, the loss of something else that is something or someone. It has to do with significant loss, and we can be, in our grief process, we can be angry, as I've already mentioned, with the person that delivers the news, such as the doctor. We can be angry with those that are not dying if we ourselves have been told that we are, as it were, terminally ill. We can be angry that a child was taken from us or a spouse was taken from us, and that anger can extend to God Himself. We can find all kinds of reasons to be angry, and we can find all kinds of persons, as it were, to be angry with. And we can be angry with God. Now, we can deny that we would be angry with God because that's a fearful thing, but God knows all about it. And God is big enough to take it if we're willing to admit, yes, God, I'm as angry as I can be because I really believe that you could have kept this from happening to me, and I know that you have allowed it to happen. So anger is one of the stages of grief that must be dealt with and that we must make, as it were, our way through. Then we have the stage of bargaining. Sometimes when we're dealing with our own potential death, persons can bargain with God. If you'll get me through this, if you'll let me live, I'll start to church. I'll be a better person. I'll treat my wife better, or my husband better, or I'll do this or I'll do that, God, if you'll get me through this. And we can also find other ways to try to bargain with God. So there can be that stage of bargaining related to our grief. And then there is the depression. And again, I talked a lot about depression in our first studies, that there's always going to be some depression in the grief process, as even if we are experiencing, and we'll be talking about bad grief and good grief, and even if we're on the good grief track, there's still going to be part of the emotional response in grief, and grief it is an emotional response to loss, can be depression. And sometimes we have to seek out a professional to have that depression treated, as it were, or medicated, or we might need medication. Well, I'm going to suggest actually that there's sometimes a professional might be needed throughout the whole grief process. Find a credentialed counselor or pastoral counselor, someone that will walk through this grief process with you. And then the final stage is acceptance. We must come to that sooner or later. And I can't say how long it might take you to get there. Some might get there a lot earlier and sooner than others. And we can't put a time limit or a timetable on these various stages of grief. But finally, for it to be good, healthy grieving, and for there to be, as we refer to as forward movement in the grief process, we must come to an acceptance of either the loss that has already taken place, the loss that is being anticipated, or the loss that we know is going to happen. There must be acceptance. You know, this is true throughout life. We have some unrealistic expectations placed on life. That life is supposed to be, as if we would get out and get honest with ourselves, we would admit that we really believe that life should be a bed of roses and that we shouldn't have these troubles, these problems, and so forth. And of course, that's a myth. As I have already used the scripture that Job said, that we that are born of woman, any of us that are born of woman, our days are few and they're full of trouble or full of grief. So we must accept sooner or later the reality of loss and losses in life, and maybe when it is a significant loss, the reality of the loss that has taken place. So then we move on, and I mentioned that there can be a bad grief and there can be a good grief. So why don't I immediately then, going on from these stages, take up the good grief and bad grief. Actually, let's put it under the umbrella of healthy grieving. When it comes down to it, bottom line, what does it mean to grieve in a healthy way? And what can be a healthy grief instead of a bad or unhealthy grief? So with a bad grief, it has to do with one's beliefs. And those beliefs must be looked at, whether they are real, whether they're truthful, or whether, as I've already mentioned, we have some myths related to the whole experience of loss. And so we look at our attachments. How were we attached to the person or thing that has been lost? And then we look at our belief about death itself. So though it spells out B-A-D, beliefs, attachments, and death. We must look at those to determine if we're experiencing a good grief or a bad grief.
I remember at my lowest point where I told my wife, I said, now this pain is so great, as I can see why a person would do drugs, alcohol, sex, food, gambling, working, shopping, hobbies to an extreme.
Divorce?
Yeah, divorce, yes. And you do anything to try to get out of this pain. And I tell men, because what I see happening with the different genders, that women tend to mourn their losses more quickly than men. And I think part of that is cultural difference that we have, that men from little boys onwards were told that big boys don't cry. And so we suck it up, like I did. After 2 or 3 weeks, I dried up my tears. And my drug of choice was work, if I could just keep working. And my wife would be at home just mourning this loss, and I'd try to keep myself busy, keep my wheels spinning so that I didn't have to face it. And I'd go home and there she'd be. And doctor, there were times that I just wanted to grab her and say, please stop it. And because I didn't want to face it. But I tell men, And I remember the old oil filter commercial where a mechanic was holding up a filter, and a dirty filter out of a car. And men understand this talk, where he said, now you're going to pay me now, or you're going to pay me later. And we understand that if you don't deal with business, if you don't take care of it, you're going to have a blown engine down the road. And guys understand that. It's so important that we face into our grief in one way or another and be able to express it instead of putting it off and going drinking it and drugging it and whatever else you can do. I think shock is a wonderful thing that God gives us to help us not to be able to feel the reality of what's happened, but gradually that subsides. As far as the length of time, I think that and I have people often ask me this, how long will I be like this? And there are so many variables, the relationship that you have with the child, the age of the child, how the child dies. There's just so many factors that come into this. But for my wife and I will say to you that it took us about 5 years before we really wanted to go on and live again.
Of course, we're not afraid of our final destination as Christians, but it's that transition of how do we get there that raises a lot of questions and anxieties for people. And that's normal, but we think two things: planning about how that is going to be. Am I afraid of pain, of separating from loved ones, of losing independence and body function? And also talking about it, not only making the plans oneself and putting it down on paper, but sharing that with people who are close. We do model even for our kids and other people around us, how are we going to face a potentially terminal illness? And talking increases distance, and facing that fact decreases the anxiety of whatever it is that we're afraid of.
And many times there's this myth that if I talk about it, it's going to make the other person feel worse, whether it's the dying person or the member of the family. And I think we need to really challenge that myth as well. Most dying people know their situation. They really probably do want to talk about it, but they don't want to make their family feel bad. And that goes the other way. And somebody needs to take the initiative, simply to say, help me understand what's going on. You know, I don't really know quite what you're feeling or thinking right now, or what is this doing to your own spiritual journey right now? But share with me. And then, as Susan said, that increases intimacy and it brings us much closer together.
I believe following James' advice to count it joy affects the attitude. It's when we don't do that and we're angry or bitter or resentful and are frightened by the trial. I mean, how will we get through this? What are we going to do? When we go ahead and count it as joy, knowing that the testing of our faith will produce fruit in our life. See, there is a purpose, there is a reason, there is a better or a good thing coming at the end of it, some reward and spiritual growth. Then that will affect the attitude. And you may have to go back and count it joy every minute or every thought of the day as you are stepping through that trial.
I appreciate your staying with us as we continue our thoughts related to bad grief. Let's back up a little bit to the whole thing of denial. Denial can bring about bad grief. Also, self-doubt, if we doubt that we have the ability to handle the loss or losses that have happened, this can create a bad grief. And then I mentioned acceptance being one of the stages of grief. So I want to back up a little bit to that and bring some things to your attention that would help you with acceptance, because non-acceptance, refusing to accept, remaining in denial, spells bad grief. Drawing from Dr. David Richo in his book, The 5 Things That We Cannot Change and the Happiness We Find by Embracing Them. And remember, I've used the Serenity Prayer in the first 2 studies. I referred to the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change And death is one of those things that we cannot change. And there are other things in life that we cannot change. And there are things that we must accept that are going to change in life. So I want to bring out these 5 things by Dr. David Richo. Everything changes and ends in life. So acceptance means that we come to grips with the temporariness of life, the impermanence of life. And then number 2, things do not always go according to plan. So when we accept that, it's easier for us to handle a loss. And then thirdly, life is not always fair. I get that said to me all the time in counseling. It's not fair. And it does appear very often that life isn't fair. And then the 4th one is pain is part of life. That is something that we must accept. And to believe otherwise is to have a bad belief that can spell bad grief. So pain is a part of life. It happens to everybody. Losses happen to everyone, and everyone experiences grief. Then the last one, people are not loving and loyal all the time. And too often we can find this true. We can find our friends missing and absent when we're going through a loss. Then we move on to healthy grieving, as I've already mentioned, and to good grief. What makes up a good grief process or gives us what I refer to as a healthy grieving process. The first thing is early and full grieving makes for a healthy grief process. We're not to put it off. We're not to shove it under the rug. We're not to remain in denial, as I've already said. Early, full grieving and doing it unashamedly. Don't let anyone rob you of the ability to cry, or the desire to cry, or the need to weep early on, because early, full grieving makes for healthy grieving. And then as we look at the grief process, we need some goals, and that is to grieve early on, as fully as we need to, and then to expect personal growth to come out of it, a transformation to come out of the process. You said, that's just going too far. Believe it or not, no matter what, when we enter a crisis, we are never the same when we come out of that crisis as when we entered that crisis. And of course, significant loss will present a crisis. And instead of being bitter when we come through the crisis, our goal should be that we be better. So then we want to make for being a better person as we enter a new normal in our lives. We're not to look back and hope that things can go back to normal. No, we're to look forward and accept, there's that word again, the fact that with the loss or losses, we are going to be entering a new normal. So the adjustment is going to be necessary as we move forward into a new normal. And even though we're given a period of time to fully grieve, sooner or later we're going to have to, as it were, re-enter life. We're going to have to make the adjustment and get ready, as it were, to move forward with the loss. And that again involves the acceptance that I have talked about. So we think of good grief, and so it's early, full, and knowing that the way life was has gone, and a new beginning, we need to look at it as a new beginning, and we have to let go of the way that it was, and that we're not going to be the same person. As I mentioned, we're going to emerge, whether we like it or not. We're going to experience change and be a different person. So we need to embrace this new, transformed person, rather than resisting the whole idea that we need to be as we were, because that is not possible. And then death. What is our view of death? Accept the reality that death is a reality of life, and we need to let the relationship go, but we can take it back, as it were, and embrace the relationship, the lost relationship, in our memories. But we still have to accept the truth that when death comes and we lose a person in death, or a significant other in death, that it is forever. It's permanent, and we can't change that. So we must see what we're going to do, as it were, with the rest of our life, and we must determine and resolve by the grace of God, asking Him for His help in moving forward in the grief process into the new normal, in embracing the new person that we will become as a result, and knowing that with God there is hope of recovery. Along with my friend and colleague H. Norman Wright's book, Experiencing Grief, which we have been offering, I wish to add a booklet that I have written titled A Widow's Grief. Within a few pages, I have summarized Naomi's grief journey found in the book of Ruth in the Holy Bible. This also appeared in a similar form in a May 2004 edition of Spirit-Led Woman magazine titled Healing the Deepest Grief. So with a phone call or letter and a donation of any size, we will send you a copy of Norman's book, plus a copy of A Widow's Grief by myself, and a fact sheet related to grief. With your donation, you join us in helping hurting people find hope and comfort from hearing about others' journeys through painful seasons, being informed related to their specific situation, becoming informed yourself so that you can reach out to hurting people, and all viewers of Time for Hope being pointed to the comforting and delivering grace found in Jesus Christ, who claims without apology to be the way, the truth, and the life. All of this provides hope no matter where anyone is on life's journey. Call us at 1-800-669-9133. You may write us at Post Office Box 2169, Spartanburg, South Carolina 29304, or visit our website, timeforhope.org. We look forward to receiving your request and financial help.